And then the last question was about my experience last year. Is that right?
Yeah, the experience last year, and then also whether or not you fundamentally come down on the side that God made you gay and you want to come to terms as a positive thing in some way, or fundamentally sinful. Like it seems like you have a very ambivalent view on whether or not you should hate that part of yourself or own it in some other way. So those two questions.
Okay. Um, well, basically, the way my experience of depression has worked is that it began when I was an adolescent, um, and has been a constant undercurrent of my life since then, but has flared up more or less seriously at various points. And I think there have been about 3 really major flare-ups. 2 when, well, one when we were undergraduates together at Grove City, which you've described. Again when I was at Oxford, and then again almost a year ago, last November. And each one has been worse than the last. Each one has been more serious, has involved more grave thoughts about the possibility of suicide. And I should mention that there have been about 5 suicides in my family within my lifetime, so that places you at risk to some degree. So this most recent one happened almost a year ago. Began with just a lot of stress in my life, not with bad things necessarily, but just being very busy, having to deal with some difficult situations, getting very angry about something on one occasion, starting to drink by myself, not a good idea, and then just plummeting into the abyss of despair. It involved, for the first time in my life, hurting myself, cutting into myself, quite superficially, but repeatedly, and thinking very seriously about suicide, and in fact also for the first time thinking very concretely about a means of doing that. I could take this razor blade I'm using to hurt myself superficially and push a bit harder in the right place, and I could achieve this. The monastic community was concerned, but I'm fairly good at displacing that sort of concern. So people would come and check on me, notice that I wasn't coming to things, and I would just explain it away somehow. I'm not feeling well, I'm upset about something, I just need a good bike ride and I'll be okay. And there was a huge sense of sort of having 2 psychologies operating at once. Part of me that recognized that this was not a good or healthy way of thinking or feeling, and that I should take steps to change it, and part of me feeling like that's just how I wanted to feel. That terribly depressed feeling is an insight that puts me in touch with the deeper reality of things, and that I just wanted to follow that to its end, its fatal end. Eventually, someone I spoke to on the Kaiser suicide hotline, which was very important, got me to commit to telling someone else in my community that I needed to go to the hospital, which is something that a very close friend who lives not too far away had also encouraged me to do. So I did. And it was a terribly difficult experience being an involuntary patient for a few days, 72 hours, but definitively needful. And my experience of how monastic community worked in the course of that terribly depressed season of my life made me think even more emphatically that this is a way of life that I need. I'm not sure I would have survived that experience if I were living on my own in an apartment or something, or even if I were somehow coupled with somebody. I mean, that's a huge thing to ask one other person to bear with you, especially when you're insistently resistant to any kind of help, which I was until there was kind of a turning point. And the attitude of the monastic community here is that doing what's necessary to help make you psychologically healthy is something they're willing to support and encourage. So I've not been stigmatized in the least degree, quite the contrary. And it's even been suggested to me by some monks that this is kind of a sign of vocation, which is how I take it to be myself. That the fact that I have these struggles and that being in monastic community is a context in which I can work them out in favor of my own mental health, but also live in a way that's fairly stable and supportive and allows me to be fruitful in terms of the various sorts of work that I do is a sign that this is a good way of life for me to be living. So that kind of forced me to recognize that my tendency to romanticize depression is something I need to maybe not get over, but contextualize.
What was that romanticization like, and did it involve theological grandeur?
Some sense of cross-bearing, although that remains, but also a sense that life is tragic, which to some degree it is, that lots of creative people of depth and insight are quite unhappy. So maybe my being quite unhappy is a sign that I might have some depth and insight and creativity. And also this sense of having a dark, hidden, despairing part of myself had a certain romantic appeal. But I was forced to come to terms with the fact that this is a potentially fatal illness. And the more I romanticize it and resist its treatment on those grounds, the more likely it is that it's going to have terribly destructive and even fatal effects. So I've come to accept thinking of it in fairly clinical terms as something to be treated with medication and therapy, something to be vigilant about. And I've also begun to step away from my tendency to romanticize sorrow itself. To think that being a sorrowful, melancholy person most of the time is who I am. I've come to see that if I accept that, it could well lead to my death, and that it's better to aspire to being a fairly content, healthy person, recognizing that there is always going to be this melancholic dimension of myself. It can't be eradicated.